The Syrian army has largely defeated the foreign-funded insurgency in the country. But now, the question of how the pieces are put back together, and whether that process will serve the larger imperial agenda in the region, hangs in the balance. This is the GRTV feature interview with your host James Corbett and our special guest, Michel Chossudovsky.
Well, essentially, the insurrection has been defeated. The evidence suggests that the Al-Qaeda affiliated rebels, which essentially are the foot soldiers of the Western Military Alliance, have been decimated by Syrian armed forces. And in other words, the question is, what happens now? The ground war is over. The so-called international community is calling for an end to the war. But at the same time, that same international community is creating conditions for the continuation of that war. There's the issue of humanitarian aid to the refugees, to the people affected by the crisis. And again, I think what troubles me is the fact that it is the aggressor nations which are bringing the humanitarian aid to Syria, when in fact these aggressor nations are responsible for war crimes. So instead of focusing on humanitarian aid in the abstract, let us focus on the issue of war reparations. In other words, reparations by the aggressor nations to rebuild that country, to repatriate people who have been displaced to neighboring countries, to rebuild the institutions which have been destroyed, the houses, the homes of the victims of this war. In other words, the causality, the underlying causality has to be put forth. This is a war of aggression. It's well established that these foot soldiers were trained and financed by the Western Military Alliance, namely United States, NATO, and Israel. Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar played a crucial role, and of course Israel. And we know that Israel was involved in supporting Al-Qaeda rebels in areas adjacent to the occupied areas of the Golan Heights. So on the Syria-Israeli border, so to speak, including, in fact, a hospital facility which was there to bring in the Al-Qaeda rebels who had been wounded and then send them back to the war theater. So that Israel, ironically, is supporting the Islamic Jihad, at least the military wing of the Islamic Jihad, with a view of destabilizing a sovereign state and a neighboring country of Israel.
Now, that this is a war of aggression that is being perpetrated by the actors that you've named should not come as a surprise to regular viewers of GRTV or people who regularly visit globalresearch.ca, but for people who have not been following this, let's set the scene and let's go over the fact that this has been a foreign-funded, foreign-trained, foreign-aided insurgency from the beginning, a terrorist force that's been unleashed in Syria since the very beginning of this conflict.
Absolutely. If we go back to February or January of 2011, we have, in fact, I think it was end of January, Robert Stephen Ford is appointed US ambassador. I happened to be in Damascus at the time of his appointment. I spent 2 months in Syria in the 2 months preceding the outbreak of the insurrection. But Robert Stephen Ford is a very important figure in an understanding of what happened. Robert Stephen Ford was number 2 man in the US Embassy under John Negroponte. And as we know, John Negroponte, which has a whole personal history of supporting and creating death squads going back to the heyday of Central America. He was based in Honduras. He sponsored the death squads in Honduras and in Nicaragua. So we're going back to another era. But he was brought to Iraq precisely to create those death squads and also to insert the death squads in the Iraqi police. Who was his number two man? Robert Stephen Ford. And Robert Stephen Ford, in fact, played a far more crucial role in Negroponte because he actually speaks Arabic and he speaks Turkish, and he was also in contact with the various factions in Iraq. And then Robert Stephen Ford, actually after a stint in Algeria, turns up in Syria. And he has played, he's a very key State Department official. He played a key role in the process of recruitment of these death squads, modeled on what had been applied previously in Iraq, and also modeled on what was called the Salvador option in Central America. So it really is the application of the Salvador option to the Middle East. And if we look at the track record of the rebel forces in Syria, we can see that the same training process applied. These are killers, and they are there to kill civilians. They have a certain pattern of executing people who are Shiite or Alawite, and then they also have procedures for executing what they call the traitors within the Sunni community. And then what was applied was the concept of ethnic cleansing in all the Christian communities in Syria. So there was a very structured insurrection which was essentially directed against the civilian population. And then what happened is that when these atrocities were committed, the Western media casually accused the Syrian government of killing its own people. The accusations were absurd, but at the time people believed them. Subsequently, many reports came through which actually contradicted this interpretation or falsification of the mainstream media. And then they started on to saying, well, there are atrocities on both sides. But the fact of the matter is that these death squads were set loose in a sovereign country with a view to destabilizing civil society. Killing people was the basis for that destabilization. The destruction of buildings and residential complexes and so on was part of it. Then we had, at a much later stage, we had the so-called chemical weapons saga. And that actually is now resurfacing as a pretext for possible intervention. It is particularly, it's being used by the French as well as the British, pointing to the fact that the Syrian armed forces are using chemical weapons against their own people. But yet, if you look at the history of this so-called chemical weapons saga, you will be able to see that there are reports from very so-called authoritative sources, including CNN, which confirm not only that the rebels, Al-Qaeda rebels, al-Nusra rebels, are in possession of chemical weapons, but they are actually being trained by Western special forces. And this is confirmed by CNN. In other words, Western special forces training the rebels. They'll probably say, well, it's not to train them, it's not to train them into using them, it's training them into familiarizing them with chemical weapons so that in the eventuality that the government has them, they would know what to do. But in fact, these al-Nusra rebels are terrorists, they're death squads, and the training that was provided to them in the use of chemical weapons is there for their use. And recently there have been other reports, even by the Turkish police, to the effect that they caught these opposition rebels with chemical weapons in their possession. It's front page news in Turkey, but here in the West and in all the mainstream reports, it's the Syrian government which is threatening its own people with chemical weapons, and consequently, the aggressors must now come in with a humanitarian mandate to prevent the Syrian government from using chemical weapons against its people, when in fact all the evidence suggests that it is the terrorists, the Al-Qaeda affiliated brigades that are in possession of chemical weapons.
Certainly from the point of view that this is an operation to overthrow the Assad government, the proxy war has been a failure and I think has been largely defeated. But there are those who argue that the entire purpose of the operation in Syria was not necessarily the overthrow of Assad, but the creation of just a destabilization campaign that effectively removes Syria from the playground when we talk about the pipeline politics that are going on generally in the region. Do you give that theory any credence? And if so, has this been a success in those terms?
I think we're in a situation where of unconventional covert warfare rather than the so-called blitzkrieg, where you go in with a no-fly zone, an air campaign, and so on. And that is what the Western military alliance has chosen for Syria, is that you destabilize its economy, you impose sanctions, you block the supply of food and fuel to the population, you create havoc, you send in these killers that go into the different parts of the country and start killing people, you create a refugee crisis, and eventually the international community will pick up the pieces, and this will lead to some kind of transition. I think that position is pretty clear. That's what's happening. However, I don't think that the Western architects of this covert warfare had planned on being wiped out. They've been wiped out, so that the conditions exist today for rebuilding of that country. In the abstract, they are there, because the ground war is over. What may occur will be selected terrorist attacks, but without any kind of territorial base. In other words, no enclave or military base and command structure of any significance. So that the command structure of the Free Syrian Army has been decimated. The only force which actually remained was al-Nusra. Al-Nusra has been decimated. And what I suspect will happen is that the insurrection may continue, but with ad hoc operations in and out of Turkey or in and out of Israel and so on, but without the kind of structure which it had until recently. Now, I think that a continuation of this war, going towards, let's say, a no-fly zone, using the pretext of weapons of mass destruction, at the moment is unlikely, because in the course of the last 2 years, Syria has been building up its air defense system. This is not to say that it didn't have an air defense system right from the outset. There's been much discussion on the S-300 Russian air defense system, but if you go back to 2006, you have declarations on the part of the Russian Ministry of Defense to the effect that they intend to station S-300 in southern Syria at the naval port of Tartus. And they say, this is our initiative to protect our naval base. In the course of the last 18 months, there have been reports of Russian advisors in air defense components coming in, essentially coming in through through the naval facility in Tartus. Everything leads us to the obvious that the S-300 is already installed and was already installed prior to the lifting of the EU arms embargo directed against Syria. And then Vladimir Putin just took the opportunity of stating what was already de facto. He said, well, we're going to deliver the S-300 to Syria, when in fact the S-300 is already in place. So that Syria has a sophisticated air defense system. It has Russian and Iranian advisors. This is well established. It would be very unwise for the Western military alliance to go to the next step and start threatening an air campaign, and on the ground the war is over. So that in effect they're in an impasse, but I think there are many options which of course are being contemplated, and they're being contemplated in the context of the broader war. We must understand that the war in Syria is part of a military roadmap. The road to Tehran goes through Damascus, and whatever military actions are taken against Syria, they are also taken in relation to actions directed against Iran. There's an integrated process of military planning. That's what people must understand. The United States and its allies, including Israel, don't simply have, let's say, 3 or 4 different war plans. They have one war plan, which is global warfare. And in the Middle East, there's a regional war theater where all these different options are examined, simulated with various scenarios. That's what they do. They put it onto the computers and so on, so that the project of destabilizing Iran with very drastic economic sanctions is part of the broader equation. So that what Syria's being subjected to sanctions, Syria's economy has been destroyed, its population has been displaced, and as you suggested, this is really the agenda. It's the agenda of weakening, destabilizing, and destroying, killing a nation. Okay, killing a nation, and then eventually leading up to some kind of negotiations. The other avenue is also the extension of the war into Lebanon, which we're seeing now. The sectarian violence is triggered. It's part of covert operations as well. But we must, I think, also recognize the historic nature of this conflict, of this war. The Syrian government has won the war. And they've won the war against the most powerful military alliance on planet Earth, which is funding their Al-Qaeda foot soldiers. And we also have to, all this depends on propaganda and counter-propaganda, develop in the course of the next few months. Counter-propaganda is very important. And that's the whole basis of this interview. We have seen some very disturbing pictures, and if the broad, let's say the broad American public come to realize the implications, I think it's very important. John Kerry negotiates directly with the commanders of Al-Qaeda. Okay? He meets up with well, theoretically is the Free Syrian Army, but in fact the Free Syrian Army is non-existent. The only fighting force is al-Nusra. So that the commander of the Free Syrian Army links up with John Kerry. John Kerry said, we're going to support you, we're going to give you money, we're going to send in military advisors, and so on. What the US public and people around the world should realize is that the US Secretary of State is not only involved in a blatant violation of international law by supporting an insurgency within a sovereign country. It's a war crime. But he is also in blatant violation of US anti-terrorist legislation. Okay? Anybody who has any kind of remote contact with an Al-Qaeda affiliated operative is immediately considered as a suspect and would normally be arrested by the FBI. Okay? Look at the fate of the Tsarnaev brothers in the Boston bombings. Now, if John Kerry or Senator John McCain have links with leaders of a terrorist organization, which is on the State Department blacklist, one would assume that they should be given the same kind of treatment as any citizen of the US which has a link with Al-Qaeda. Okay? Double standards. John Kerry is Secretary of State, yet the US State Department says that al-Nusra is an illegal terrorist organization, but this doesn't prevent John Kerry from funding money to al-Nusra on behalf of the US government. Okay? So then it raises the broader issue of the relationship between Al-Qaeda and the US government or US intelligence, something which we have known for at least 30 years, that Al-Qaeda is a creation of the CIA, yet everybody says, oh, it's a blowback. They turned against us. Okay, we helped to create them back in the heyday of the Soviet-Afghan War. They've turned against us, etc., etc. No, there hasn't been a single moment in the last 30 years that the CIA has broken its link with Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda's intelligence asset, and the recent developments show unequivocally that there is an interface between agencies of the US government, including the US State Department, and these Al-Qaeda affiliated formations, which are trained and recruited in Saudi Arabia and Qatar, and funded from various sources, including the United States, NATO, Israel, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Turkey. And that has to be addressed. Okay? You can't, because that makes the whole structure of the global war on terrorism topple. You can't wage a global war on terrorism and then ask the terrorists to do it for you. Okay? So in effect, what we now see is very visibly, not and in a way which we've never seen it before, is that the United States government is the terror state, because it is not only training Al-Qaeda, financing Al-Qaeda, but it is also interfacing on a regular basis with Al-Qaeda, where senior members of the administration and of the US Senate go in and start chatting with Al-Qaeda affiliates. And then, is that a new normal? Well, if it's a new normal, I think what we have to do is to reveal that this new normal is a criminal project. You can't wage a war on terrorism and then have an amicable financial arrangement with these terrorists and use them as your foot soldiers to wage your wars of conquest. So then what I'm saying there is that the global war on terrorism as a structure, as a concept, is starting to tumble down.
For more on this story and other breaking news and current events, please go to globalresearch.ca. For more research and analysis by James Corbett, please go to corbettreport.com. The Center for Research on Globalization depends on your support. To purchase a book or DVD, or to make a donation, please visit globalresearch.ca today.